अब मैं गुज़ारिश करना चाहूँगा जामिया मिलिया इस्लामिया के हिस्ट्री डिपार्टमेंट के प्रोफ़ेसर लेकिन इस वक़्त कन्नूर यूनिवर्सिटी केरला में वाइस चांसलर प्रोफ़ेसर गोपीनाथ रविंद्रन साहब से आप जानते हैं कि वो जामिया में पढ़ाते हैं और आप सब लोगों ने मैंने तो उनको देखा है, ख़ास तौर पर जब भी जामिया के अंदर और जामिया के बाहर, चाहे वो जामिया टीचर्स एसोसिएशन के ज़रिए हो या दूसरे जो इदारे हैं उसके ज़रिए हो, जब डेमोक्रेटिक राइट्स की, ह्यूमन राइट्स की बात आई यूनिवर्सिटी के अंदर भी और यूनिवर्सिटी के बाहर भी तो उन्होंने आवाज़ उठाई और आज भी जब कभी इस तरह की कोई बात आती है, तो वो पेशो-पेश रहते हैं। आज के इस प्रोग्राम के चीफ गेस्ट हैं प्रोफ़ेसर गोपीनाथ। मैं उनसे रिक्वेस्ट करूँगा कि वो अपनी बातें रखें। शुक्रिया।
Thank you. Thank you, Mehtawalam Sahab. I was very touched when Ghazal Mehdi and my old colleague, Professor Azizuddin Hussain, called me on the phone day before. I was in Kannur. Right now I'm in Delhi, asking me to be part of this International Alumni Association meeting. So thank you for inviting me. I'm not an alumnus of Jamia. I've never studied in Jamia, but I think I've spent most of my teaching years, nearly all my teaching years in Jamia. And therefore, I think if I have learned anything as a teacher, I've done so in Jamia. I'm not going to go into the history of Jamia Millia Islamia. I think Talib Bhai has done that very well, and so has Dr. Saida Hamid. I'm going to talk about, I'll take about maybe about 8 minutes to talk about my experiences in Jamia, and that in some way is going to touch upon many of the ideas and points that have been made in the earlier two presentations. You see, I've lived nearly all my life in Delhi, and it was first in 1964 or 65 that I went to Jamia as a very small child. We went on a picnic, and I remember riding a camel on the banks of the Yamuna. It was a sand dune, that's what I remember. Kikar ke ped ki baat hui thi, so kikar ke ped mujhe bhi yaad hai. But that was the end of my association with Jamia after age 4 or 5. Next, I hear about Jamia when I finished my BA in college in Delhi University. And one of my very close friends told me that he's going to go to Jamia. This was 1982. So I asked Kasmi, Kasmi, why are you going to Jamia? It's some madrasa somewhere. So he says, no, they've started this new center there called MCRC. So I've got admission there, and my friend Ali Kasmi belonged to the first batch of MCRC in Jamia. So that's the time that I hear about Jamia as an institution. Then it was after that I went to JNU, and when I was doing my MA, we took a bus. We heard that Irfan Habib Sahab was speaking in Jamia. So we all took a bus and went. That was the first Ansari Memorial Lecture. So we took a bus from JNU and came to Jamia. I think that part of the Vice-Chancellor's building complex is no longer there, or it's been remodeled so much that you can't recognize it anymore. That's my third encounter with Jamia. And then, after having finished my MPhil, a friend of mine said they're looking for teachers in Jamia. And Professor Zoya Hassan might not remember it, but I was asked to meet Professor Mushirul Hassan and Professor Zoya Hassan's residence in JNU. So he asked me to come over to Jamia, and I went over, and I joined there as an ad hoc teacher. I stayed 1 year there, or a couple of months there, went back to Delhi University, and then came back in 1988. So when I came to Jamia, it had just about no, it's after I joined that it became a central university. When I joined, it was still a deemed university. The Jamia that I saw there was a very small, compact place. Not very much life there. I'm not going to, make any eulogies for Jamia. But when I came in the 1980s, I got a job. I came here to Jamia. It was a small place, not very, the buildings were not great. Teaching community was small. Everybody knew everybody else. So personal relationships were very important. People knew everybody by name. And I remember our neighbors, because our neighboring department, Taleb was in sociology, and we used to run away to sociology department because, unlike history, other than Mushirul Hasan Sahab, we found, there was a kindred spirit with the people in sociology. So Talib was there, and so was late Vikram Nanda was there. So I remember Jamia in those days. Those were the days when there was very little. You couldn't think of Jamia in terms of Nai Talim. I mean, when you looked at Jamia as an outsider, I never lived in Jamia. So as an outsider came to Jamia, who had read the history of Jamia, but when you saw that place, you couldn't associate it with the lofty ideals of the freedom movement, or with Nai Talim, or with anything very lofty, But there were very people there. Students were unruly. This was the Jamia of the late 80s and early 90s. I think the trend continues. Jamia, as has been mentioned earlier, I think Dr. Saida talked about the spirit of Jamia or the idea of Jamia. I think basically the idea of Jamia was political, right from the time of its inception. The idea of Jamia was subversive. So whenever it stopped being faithful to that idea, I think Jamia went astray. So 1980s, late 80s and early 90s, in fact, we saw not very nice things happening in Jamia. The controversies over Salman Rushdie's book, about what Mushir Saab had to undergo. But this was one phase. So every institution has these ups and downs. But in the 90s or early 90s, this was a time when the country was getting more and more communalized also. We shouldn't forget that. Jamia, in a way, the problems of Jamia, in a way, reflects the politics of the country, I think, right from the time of its inception. 1990s, not a very happy time. Gradually, things improved. Then, when Munshi Saab came back as Vice-Chancellor, I think that was a very major turning point in the recent history of Jamia Millia Islamia. This is the time when Jamia was put on the intellectual map of the country firmly as a modern institution. I remember in 1988, I shouldn't take very much time, but I remember in 1988, Murshid Saab asked us to do a seminar on economic history. So some IIT professors had come, and one of them said, "Oh, when Mushir came here, we thought it's a madrasa." So this is what had happened to Jamia in the 80s and 90s. From the 90s, I think Jamia intellectually once again regained its rightful place in the intellectual history of the country. It opened up both physically as well as in terms of new people coming in, new disciplines being set up. And there was debate, but still, my one complaint against Jamia is that the democratic movement inside the university has not been very strong. When I joined Jamia, I remember Talib's department, the head of the department, They all belonged to the old CPI. They were old communists, not very active politically, but they had that worldview with them still. When that generation passed away of teachers or they retired, they left the institution. I think for some time there was a kind of, in terms of a political moral compass, we were in a kind of a wilderness. And the student politics at that time, the dominant student politics was something like Delhi University or so. There were knifings and shootings and so on. But all this changes by the time we enter the next century, 2000. The student movement becomes more vibrant. New teachers have been appointed in the university. There is general political activity, debate, discussions. That is happening. That's in the first decade of the current century. So whenever we had the Jamia lived up to its ideal of, it's the idea of Jamia, and the idea of Jamia was to bring about progressive changes for the Muslim community, and so it was in many ways dependent on the government of the day, and the government of the day had undue influence over Jamia. It was seen as a Muslim institution, and later on, Jamia itself called itself a Muslim institution, which it was culturally and ideologically and historically. So, the government influence on Jamia, it was a kind throughout, and from the time I've come there, for a Muslim, you had to be a nationalist. You had to say, I'm a nationalist Muslim. Then you could make some, noises about wrong government policies or something. But you always had to, as Saida Hamid said, you had to prove yourself, and that continues even till today. I think if you're a Muslim, you have to say that I'm a nationalist Muslim, and we saw it in the recent protests. But after 2000, the last 5 or 6 years, 3 years I've been away from the institution, but in the last couple of years, the students have become much more vocal. Not just the students, also the girls especially. And I'm delighted by seeing this. The girls in Jamia have become very, very vocal. In fact, much more than the boys. And this bodes well for the institution. The teachers, I'm very sorry to say, are still very scared. Teachers everywhere are scared, but the teachers in Jamia have been, even more scared than teachers elsewhere, or they have not been very concerned. But given the politics that we have today, Taleb talked about what was popularly known as the Rowlatt Act. The Rowlatt Act was actually called the Anarchical and Revolutionary Crimes Act of 1990. Now, what the kind of government, the draconian measures that the government took in 1919, it seems we are witnessing that once again. We are witnessing that in terms of our own students being in jail, being accused of crimes for which I don't think that they're guilty of these crimes. If there's a riot happening in Northeast Delhi, I don't think somebody who was students who are demonstrating, agitating in southeastern Delhi peacefully can be held guilty of riots in some other part of the country or part of some great international conspiracy. So these are problems that students anywhere are going to face, and more so in Jamia because of the fact it is seen and it sees itself also now as a Muslim institution. So the problems will be, more for the students of Jamia. Anybody in Jamia who wants to speak up against what she or he thinks are wrong policies. But as long as students come out and speak and have started speaking, if the teachers also start, openly at least airing their views. Yes, when government policies get draconian, many people get scared of speaking. I can understand that. But we must, in our classrooms, we must, in our limited ways, try and raise a voice against things that we think are not good for the country, for the nation, for the idea of India. Because I think the idea of Jamia is very closely linked to the idea of India, what many of us think is the idea of India. So the two can't be divorced. So defending the idea of Jamia of the 1920s, of our founding fathers, would mean that we will be doing a great service in safeguarding to the best of our ability the idea of India as it developed in the course of the anti-imperialist struggle. So, as the speaker says, Jamia is not about buildings and new courses or an act grade. It is if we are able to defend this idea, and at many points, Jamia has done that very well. And I'm sure that in the days to come, whatever the challenges be before us, the idea of Jamia and the idea of India will be defended by the Jamia community. Thank you very much indeed.